Welcome back, my friend. Before tonight's story begins, take a quiet moment for yourself. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let tonight's quiet journey begin. So tonight, we're not exploring life as we know it, not movement, not sound, not change. We're going somewhere deeper than that, a place where the ocean no longer behaves like a world, but like something that has already come to rest. And as we go, there's nothing you need to follow, nothing you need to understand, only the quiet, waiting far below everything else. The first place without light. Tonight, we begin with something very quiet, not a place you can see clearly, not a moment that arrives all at once, but something that slowly, almost gently, fades away. Light at the surface of the ocean. Light feels constant. Even at night, there is always something. Moonlight resting on the water, distant stars trembling in reflection, the faint glow of the horizon stretching far beyond what your eyes can follow. It never feels completely gone. It feels softened, dimmed, but still present, still reachable. And for most of human history, that was enough. People stood at the edge of the sea and believed they understood it. The water moved, the tides shifted, the wind carried its surface into patterns that could be seen, measured, predicted. The ocean felt alive, but not unreachable, mysterious, but not beyond imagination, because everything they knew existed where light could still reach. But tonight, we are not staying there. Tonight, we begin to move downward, not quickly. There is no reason to hurry. The ocean does not rush, and neither do we. Instead, we descend slowly, as if time itself has softened around us. The surface above begins to drift further away, not in distance alone, but in feeling. At first, nothing seems different. The water is still familiar. The light still surrounds you, though slightly dimmer, as if a thin veil has been placed between you and the world above. Colors are still present, shapes still clear, movement still easy to follow. But if you remain here for a moment longer, something begins to shift. It is subtle, so subtle that you might not notice it immediately. The brightness around you begins to lose its certainty. It no longer feels strong. It no longer fills the space the way it did above. Instead, it begins to thin, like a memory that is slowly being forgotten. As you continue downward, the light does not disappear in a dramatic way. There is no sudden darkness, no clear boundary that separates day from night. Instead, the light withdraws. It becomes weaker, less defined, more distant. The world around you changes in response. Colors begin to soften, edges begin to blur, and the contrast between things, the sharpness that once allowed you to distinguish one object from another, starts to fade. You are still able to see, but you are no longer seeing clearly. And this is where the ocean begins to feel different, not darker, not yet, but quieter, in a way that is difficult to describe, because light does more than illuminate. It creates definition. It creates certainty. It allows the mind to understand what it is looking at without hesitation. And as that clarity begins to fade, something else takes its place. Uncertainty. but not the kind that feels unsettling, the kind that feels open, as if the world around you no longer needs to be fully understood. At around 200 meters below the surface, you enter a region often described as the twilight zone. But the word twilight carries with it a meaning that does not quite belong here on land. Twilight is a transition, a brief moment between day and night, a pause that lasts only minutes before darkness takes over. But here, twilight does not pass. It remains. It stretches downward for hundreds of meters, a long and gradual fading that never quite reaches completion. A place where light still exists, but no longer serves the purpose it once did. If you were to look around you now, you would notice that the light has taken on a different quality. It is no longer white. It is no longer warm. It has become blue, a deep, muted blue that feels distant, almost detached from its source. It no longer seems to come from above. It simply exists faintly throughout the water. And in that blue, shapes begin to lose their edges. Objects no longer appear solid. They appear softened, as if they are part of the water itself, rather than separate from it. Movement becomes harder to follow, not because things have stopped moving, but because the contrast that once made movement visible is no longer strong enough to reveal it clearly. You begin to realize that seeing is becoming more difficult, not impossible, but less reliable. And as that realization settles, something else begins to change. The sound of the world above disappears. There are no waves here, no wind, no distant echoes of the surface. The ocean, which once felt alive with motion and noise, becomes still, not empty, but quiet in a way that feels complete. The kind of quiet that does not wait to be broken. The kind that exists fully, without interruption. And in that quiet, your mind begins to respond. At first, it might search for something familiar, a point of reference, a sound, a shape, a direction that confirms where you are. But there is nothing here that demands that kind of attention, nothing that pulls you outward. And so, slowly, your attention begins to turn inward. Your thoughts become softer, less urgent, because there is nothing here that requires urgency. No sudden changes, no unpredictable movement, no signals that demand immediate reaction, only a steady, unchanging environment that asks nothing of you. And in that absence of demand, the mind begins to rest, not sleep, but rest in a deeper sense, a release from the need to constantly process, to constantly interpret, to constantly decide what matters and what does not. Here, everything simply exists, and that is enough. As you drift a little deeper, the faint blue light around you continues to fade. It does not vanish, but it becomes weaker, thinner, more distant from perception. You might look upward and still see a trace of brightness, a reminder that the surface is still there, still reachable in theory, but it no longer feels close. It feels far, not in distance alone, but in meaning, because the world above, the world of light, of color, of constant movement, no longer defines what you are experiencing now. You are entering a different environment, one that does not rely on light to exist. And as that understanding begins to take shape, something else becomes clear. Darkness is not something that arrives suddenly. It is not an event. It is not a moment. It is a process, a slow and continuous reduction of light until it is no longer present. But more than that, it is a shift in perception, because as light fades, the way you experience the world changes with it. You begin to rely less on what you can see and more on what you can sense, not through touch, not through sound, but through awareness, a quiet sensitivity to presence, to space, to the subtle changes in the environment that do not announce themselves in obvious ways. And in that awareness, there is a kind of calm, not because the environment is comforting, but because it is consistent, unchanging, predictable in its stillness. There is nothing here that surprises you, nothing that interrupts the quiet, only the gradual continuation of depth, extending downward beyond what you can see. And as we continue this descent, slowly, without urgency, the light above will fade even further until eventually it is no longer visible at all, not hidden, not blocked, but gone. And when that happens, you will not experience it as a sudden loss. You will experience it as something that has already been happening all along, a quiet transition into the first place without light, the depth where colors disappear. As we continue downward, slowly, without any need to reach the bottom, something begins to change again, not in a way that feels sudden, not in a way that calls attention to itself, but in a way that quietly reshapes how you experience everything around you. At first, it may feel like nothing more than a soft dimming. The light, already weakened from above, continues to thin. It no longer spreads evenly through the water. It no longer fills the space. Instead, it lingers faintly, as if it is unsure whether it should remain at all. And then, something even more subtle begins to happen. Color starts to disappear, not all at once, not in a single moment, but gradually, one by one. If you imagine holding something in your hand here, something that on the surface would have been bright, vibrant, full of life, you would begin to notice that it no longer appears the same. The first color to fade is red. It does not vanish dramatically. It simply stops being visible. What was once rich and warm becomes darker, then dull, then almost indistinguishable from the surrounding water. Then orange begins to follow, then yellow, each color disappearing at its own depth, like voices quietly leaving a room until only silence remains. By the time you drift further down, the world has lost much of what once made it recognizable. Only blue remains, a deep, muted blue that seems less like a color and more like a condition. It is no longer something you see. It is something you are within. And even that blue begins to fade. It becomes thinner, softer, less present, until eventually, color itself is no longer part of the world around you. Not because it has been removed, but because there is no longer enough light to reveal it. And this is where something truly quiet, but deeply profound, begins to take place. Without color, the world changes, not in structure, not in substance, but in perception. Objects no longer announce themselves through contrast. They no longer stand out. They no longer tell you what they are through brightness or tone. Instead, they become shapes, soft outlines, subtle presences, suggestions of form rather than clear definitions. And in that shift, your mind begins to respond because the human mind is used to color. It relies on it. It uses color to distinguish, to identify, to decide what is important and what can be ignored. But here, that system no longer works. And so, gently, without force, the mind begins to let go of it. It stops trying to label everything immediately, stops trying to interpret every detail, stops searching for clarity where clarity no longer exists, and instead, it begins to observe quietly, patiently, without expectation. There is a certain calm that comes with that, a kind of release, because without color, without contrast, without sharpness, there is less to process, less to analyze, less to react to. The world becomes simpler, not empty, but reduced to its most essential elements: presence, space, movement, if there is any. And as you drift deeper into this colorless environment, something else begins to change as well. Time. At the surface, time is easy to feel. The sun rises, the sun sets, shadows move, light shifts. Everything around you reflects the passage of time in ways that are impossible to ignore. But here, there are no such markers, no sunrise, no sunset, no gradual shift from day to night, only a continuous, unchanging dimness that does not evolve. And without those signals, your sense of time begins to soften. Minutes no longer feel distinct. Moments do not stand apart from one another. Instead, everything blends into a single, continuous experience, a quiet flow without clear divisions. You are not aware of time passing. You are simply within it. And in that state, something within you begins to slow. Not because you choose to slow down, but because there is nothing here that requires speed, nothing that demands quick thinking, nothing that pulls your attention in different directions. Only stillness, only the gentle presence of an environment that does not change. And in that stillness, your thoughts begin to stretch. They become longer, softer, less structured, more like a drift than a sequence. And this is where the ocean reveals something that is easy to overlook. It is not only the absence of light that defines this depth, it is the absence of urgency. Without color, without clear movement, without time markers, the mind is no longer pushed forward. It is no longer pulled toward the next moment. It is allowed to remain, to exist within the present without needing to move beyond it. And that can feel unfamiliar at first, because on the surface, everything encourages motion, progress, change. But here, none of those things are required. Nothing is waiting for you. Nothing needs to be completed. Nothing is about to happen. Everything that exists here already is. And as that realization settles, the environment begins to feel even more stable, more grounded, more complete in its stillness. If you were to look around now, you would not see color. You would not see brightness. You would see a world reduced to its most minimal form. And in that minimalism, there is a kind of clarity, not the clarity of sharp detail, but the clarity of simplicity. There is nothing here that overwhelms you, nothing that competes for attention, nothing that needs to be understood all at once. Only a quiet, consistent presence that surrounds you completely. And within that presence, you begin to feel something else, a kind of detachment from the surface, not as a loss, not as something to be concerned about, but as a natural shift, because the further you move away from light, the less the surface defines your experience. It becomes less relevant, less immediate, less connected to what you are feeling now. And instead, this environment becomes your reference point. This stillness, this absence of color, this quiet, unchanging space. And in accepting that, there is a subtle sense of ease, because once you stop expecting the world to look the way it does above, you no longer notice what is missing. You only notice what is here. And what is here is enough to hold your attention without overwhelming it, enough to allow your mind to rest without forcing it, enough to exist without needing to become anything else. As we continue downward, slowly, without any need to reach a destination, this simplicity will deepen. The faint traces of blue will fade even further. The outlines will soften even more, and the world will move closer to something that is not defined by sight at all, but by presence alone. A place where color has not been taken away, but has simply stopped being part of the experience. And in that place, the mind finds a different kind of quiet, one that does not depend on what you see, but on what no longer needs to be seen. The pressure that grows without sound. As we continue our descent, slowly, gently, there is something happening all around you, but you cannot hear it. You cannot see it. And perhaps most strangely, you do not feel it in the way you might expect. Pressure at the surface. Pressure is something you rarely think about. It is always there, resting quietly on everything, including you. But it does not demand attention. It does not make itself known. It simply exists, unnoticed, like the air itself. But here, in the deepening ocean, pressure begins to change. Not suddenly, not in a way that announces itself, but steadily. With each meter you move downward, every small descent adds more weight, more presence, more of something that cannot be seen, yet surrounds you completely. At first, it feels no different. The water is still calm. The environment is still quiet. Nothing appears to press against you. Nothing seems to resist your movement. And yet, something is building, slowly, relentlessly, without interruption. If you were to pause here and allow yourself to become aware of your surroundings, you might begin to sense it, not as a force, but as a condition, a kind of invisible presence that fills every part of the space around you. Unlike sound, it does not travel. Unlike light, it does not fade. It simply increases, layer by layer, depth by depth. As you drift further down, the idea of pressure begins to shift in your mind. It no longer feels like something external, something pushing inward. Instead, it feels like something that exists everywhere at once. There is no direction to it, no origin, no edge. It is not above you, not below you, not around you, in a way that can be separated. It is simply present, complete, and because it is everywhere, it feels strangely balanced. There is no sense of being pushed, no sense of being crushed, only a quiet awareness that the environment has become denser, heavier, more complete, in its stillness. This is what makes the deep ocean so unusual. Even as the pressure increases to levels that are almost impossible to imagine, the experience of it remains calm, because there is nothing here that changes quickly, nothing that reacts suddenly, nothing that disrupts the steady, unbroken nature of this depth. Everything moves slowly. Everything exists within limits that have been shaped over vast stretches of time. If something shifts, it shifts gradually. If something moves, it moves without urgency. And because of that, the entire environment feels stable, not fragile, not tense, but steady, held in place by the very pressure that defines it. If you imagine drifting here without resistance, without effort, you might begin to notice how different this feels from the world above. On the surface, movement is constant. The wind disturbs the water. The tides pull and release. Storms form and disappear, and everything feels subject to change. But here, there is no such disruption. The deeper you go, the less the surface matters, the less its influence reaches you, and eventually, it feels as though the surface no longer exists at all. Not because it is gone, but because it no longer affects anything here. This depth is governed by something else, something slower, something more consistent, something that does not respond to daily cycles or seasonal shifts. Pressure becomes the defining presence, not as a force to resist, but as a condition that shapes everything, every movement, every form, every moment. And within that condition, there is a kind of calm that is difficult to describe, because it is not the calm of still air or quiet water. It is the calm of inevitability, a sense that nothing here needs to change. Nothing here is waiting for something else to happen. Everything is already settled into the only state it can exist in. And in that realization, your own sense of movement begins to change. You no longer feel the need to move quickly. You no longer feel the need to reach anything, because there is nowhere here that is different from where you are. No variation, no contrast, only a continuous environment that extends in every direction. And within that continuity, your mind begins to slow, not forced, not controlled, but naturally, because there is nothing here that encourages speed, nothing that demands attention, nothing that interrupts the quiet. If you allow yourself to remain here for a moment longer, drifting within this invisible presence, you may begin to notice something even more subtle. The way your awareness adjusts. At the surface, awareness is often directed outward. It moves from one thing to another, responding to changes, reacting to stimuli, constantly shifting. But here, there is nothing to react to, nothing that changes quickly enough to require response. And so, awareness becomes still. It spreads out. It becomes less focused on specific details and more attuned to the overall presence of the environment. You are not noticing individual things. You are noticing everything at once. The depth, the stillness, the quiet weight that surrounds you. And in that expanded awareness, there is a sense of being held, not confined, not restricted, but contained, as if the entire environment is gently keeping everything in place. Nothing drifts too far. Nothing moves too fast. Everything exists within a balance that is maintained without effort. And this is where the nature of pressure becomes clearer. It is not simply something that increases, it is something that stabilizes. It removes the possibility of sudden change. It prevents disruption. It ensures that everything remains within the slow, steady rhythm of the deep ocean. And because of that, there is a kind of peace here, not the peace of comfort, but the peace of consistency. A world where nothing surprises you, a world where nothing breaks the quiet, a world where everything has already adjusted to the conditions that define it. As you continue to drift downward, the pressure continues to grow, but it does not become overwhelming. It does not become something you need to escape from. It simply becomes more complete, more present, more fully integrated into the environment. And eventually, you stop noticing it as something separate. It is no longer something happening to you. It is something you are within, something that defines the space and everything inside it. And in that state, the idea of depth begins to change. It is no longer about distance. It is no longer about how far you have traveled. It is about how fully you have entered this environment, how much you have allowed yourself to become part of its stillness. Because the deeper you go, the less the surface matters, the less the concept of above and below feels meaningful, and the more everything becomes a single, continuous presence. Pressure, stillness, depth, all blending together into something that does not need to be understood, only experienced. And as that experience settles, your mind continues to quiet. Your thoughts become softer, less defined, less structured, until they begin to feel like the environment itself, slow, steady, unbroken. And in that quiet, you begin to understand something that is easy to miss. The deepest parts of the ocean are not defined by what is there. They are defined by what is no longer needed. Light, color, sound, urgency, all of it fades away, leaving only what remains when everything unnecessary is gone. Presence, stillness, and the quiet, unchanging weight of the ocean itself. And as we continue downward, even this sense of pressure, this steady, invisible presence, will become something you no longer notice at all, because it will not have changed. Only your awareness of it will. And in that shift, the ocean will feel even deeper, even quieter, even more complete in its silence. The last hint of the surface. As we continue downward, slowly, without any need to reach an end, something begins to change once more. Not in the water, not in the space around you, but in the way you relate to what is above. Until now, there's always been a quiet awareness of the surface, even as the light faded, even as color disappeared, even as the environment became still and heavy with depth. There was still a sense of direction, up towards something familiar, towards something known, toward a place that still belonged to the world you understand. But here, that sense begins to dissolve, not suddenly, not in a way that feels like loss, but gradually, like something that is no longer needed. If you were to pause and look upward now, you might still see it, a faint glow, not bright, not clear, but present enough to remind you that the surface still exists, far above, distant, unreachable in any immediate sense. The light no longer spreads through the water. It no longer illuminates anything around you. It has become a suggestion rather than a source, a quiet trace that exists only because it has not yet fully disappeared. And this is what makes this moment so subtle. The light is still there, but it no longer matters. It no longer defines your surrounding. It no longer shapes your experience. It is simply above, and above is no longer where your attention rests. At first, this may feel unfamiliar because the human mind is used to orientation. It wants direction. It wants to know where things are in relation to each other, up and down, near and far, light and dark. But here, those distinctions begin to lose their meaning. The faint glow above does not guide you. It does not help you understand where you are. It does not pull you toward it. It simply exists at a distance that feels more like memory than reality. And in that realization, something within you begins to shift. Your attention no longer reaches upward. It no longer searches for brightness. It no longer expects the environment to become clearer, lighter, more defined. Instead, it begins to settle here within the depth, within the stillness, within the quiet space that surrounds you completely. And this is the moment when the descent changes its meaning. Until now, it may have felt like a movement away from something, away from light, away from the surface, away from familiarity. But here, it begins to feel like a movement into something, into depth, into presence, into a world that does not depend on what exists above, because the surface, while still real, is no longer relevant. Not to what you are experiencing now, not to what surrounds you, not to the rhythm of this environment. Everything that matters is here. And as that understanding settles, the faint glow above becomes even less significant. You may still see it if you choose to look, but you no longer feel connected to it. It does not call you back. It does not define where you are. It is simply something that belongs to another place, another layer, another world. And in letting go of that connection, there is a quiet kind of ease, because once you stop measuring your experience against what exists above, you no longer feel the absence of those things. You no longer notice what is missing. You no longer compare. You simply exist within what is, and what is enough. The darkness around you is no longer something that contrasts with light. It is not something that replaces brightness. It is simply the condition of this space, the natural state of an environment that has never depended on light to exist. And within that state, there is a kind of stability. Nothing here is changing. Nothing is shifting in a way that demands attention. There are no cycles, no transitions, no movement from one state to another. Only continuity, a quiet, unbroken presence that extends in every direction. If you allow yourself to remain here without trying to move, without trying to reach anything, you may begin to feel something else, a sense of detachment, not from yourself, but from the idea of needing to go somewhere. Because at the surface, everything encourages movement. There is always a next place, a next moment, a next change. But here, none of that exists. There is no next. There is only this, and that can feel unfamiliar at first, because the mind is used to progression, to sequence, to moving from one thing to another. But in this depth, there is no sequence, no clear progression, only a continuous state that does not need to become anything else. And in that state, your thoughts begin to change. They become less structured, less focused on direction, less concerned with what comes next. Next, they begin to drift, not aimlessly, but gently, following the same quiet rhythm that defines the environment around you. And as your thoughts soften, your awareness deepens, not outward, but inward. You become more aware of the stillness, more aware of the space, more aware of the subtle presence of everything that exists without needing to be seen. And in that awareness, the last hint of the surface continues to fade. It does not disappear all at once. It simply becomes less noticeable, less relevant, less present in your perception, until eventually, even if it is still there, you no longer think about it. You no longer look for it. You no longer expect it to return, because you have already adjusted to a world without it, a world where light is not required, where direction is not necessary, where movement is not expected, only presence, only stillness, only depth. And in that depth, there is a kind of quiet that is complete, not the absence of sound, but the absence of interruption. Nothing here breaks the continuity. Nothing disrupts the calm. Everything exists within a balance that has been maintained for longer than you can imagine. And in that balance, you find yourself becoming part of it, not separate, not observing from a distance, but existing within it fully, without resistance, without expectation, without the need to return to what was above, because what was above no longer defines what is here, and what is here no longer needs anything else. As we continue this descent even deeper into the ocean, the last trace of the surface will fade completely, not as a loss, not as something taken away, but as something that has simply ceased to matter. And in that moment, you will no longer feel as though you have left the surface behind. You will feel as though you have arrived somewhere else entirely, a place where the idea of above no longer exists, a place where depth is not measured but experienced, a place where the darkest parts of the ocean begin to reveal themselves, not through what you can see, but through what no longer needs to be seen at all. The place where light finally ends. As we continue downward, slowly, without any urgency, there comes a point where something very quiet happens. Not a transition you can clearly see, not a moment you can point to and say, this is where it changed, but something that feels final. The last hint of light disappears, not suddenly, not like a switch turning off, but like a memory that has been fading for so long. You only realize it is gone after it is already no longer there. If you were to look upward now, you would not see that faint glow anymore. There is no trace of brightness, no distant blue, no suggestion of the surface, only darkness, complete, unbroken. And yet, it does not feel empty. It does not feel frightening, because this darkness is not something that arrived suddenly. You have been moving toward it slowly, gently, for a long time. Your mind has already adjusted. Your senses have already softened. Your expectations have already changed. So when the light finally disappears, it does not feel like loss. It feels natural, as if this is where you were always meant to arrive. This is the point where the ocean no longer belongs to the world of light. It no longer reflects the sky. It no longer responds to day or night. It no longer carries any trace of what exists above. It becomes something entirely its own, a place defined not by what is visible, but by what is no longer needed. If you pause here and simply remain, without trying to move, you may begin to notice something unexpected. The darkness is not flat. It is not empty. It has depth, not depth in distance, but depth in presence. It feels layered, even though you cannot see those layers. It feels vast, even though there is nothing to measure that vastness against. And in that vastness, your awareness begins to change again, because without light, your eyes are no longer the primary way you understand the world. They no longer guide you. They no longer provide certainty. They simply exist without purpose. And so, your attention shifts not outward, not toward objects or shapes, but toward something more subtle. Presence, the sense that something exists, even when it cannot be seen. The sense of space, even when there is no boundary. The sense of being within something that extends far beyond what you can perceive. And in that shift, the darkness begins to feel less like an absence and more like a condition, a natural state, a kind of quiet environment that does not need light to define it. If you imagine remaining here, drifting slowly without direction, you might begin to feel how stable this place is. Nothing changes quickly. Nothing interrupts the stillness. There are no sudden movements, no shifting shadows, no signals that something is about to happen. Only continuity, a steady, unbroken presence that feels the same in every moment. And in that continuity, time becomes even less distinct. There are no markers here, no events, no transitions, only a continuous state that does not divide itself into before and after. You are not moving through time. You are simply within it. And as that realization settles, your thoughts begin to soften even further. They lose their edges. They lose their urgency. They become quieter, slower, more like the environment itself. This is what makes this depth so unusual. It is not defined by what is there. It is defined by what has been removed. Light, color, clear direction, all of it has faded away, leaving only what remains when everything unnecessary is gone. And what remains is enough. Enough to hold your awareness without overwhelming it. Enough to exist without needing to change. Enough to allow your mind to rest. If you listen closely, not with your ears, but with your attention, you may begin to notice something else, a kind of silence that is different from anything above. Not the silence of a quiet room, not the silence of night, but a deeper silence, a silence that does not wait to be broken, a silence that is complete in itself. There is no background noise here, no distant hum, no subtle movement, only the absence of sound in its most complete form. And in that silence, there is a kind of stillness that feels almost physical, as if the environment itself is holding everything in place. Nothing drifts too far. Nothing moves too quickly. Everything exists within a balance that is maintained without effort. And this is where the ocean reveals something that is easy to overlook. The deepest places are not chaotic. They are not unpredictable. They are not constantly changing. They are steady, more steady than almost anywhere else on Earth, because at this depth, there is nothing left to disturb the environment. No wind, no waves, no sudden shifts, only pressure and time working together, slowly, continuously, over distances that are almost impossible to imagine. And in that slow, continuous process, everything has already settled. Everything has already adjusted. Everything exists in the only way it can. And because of that, there is no tension, no instability, only a quiet, complete form of existence. If you allow yourself to remain here without trying to move, without trying to understand everything, you may begin to feel something else, a sense of release, because there is nothing here that asks anything of you. No need to react, no need to decide, no need to move forward, only the option to remain, to exist within this depth without needing to change it. And in that stillness, your awareness becomes even more subtle. You begin to notice the space rather than the objects within it. You begin to feel the presence rather than search for detail. You begin to exist without needing to define anything. And this is where the darkness becomes complete, not as an absence, but as a state, a place where light has not been taken away, but has simply stopped existing altogether. And in that place, the ocean becomes something entirely different, not a surface, not a reflection, not a movement, but a vast, quiet depth that exists entirely on its own. And as we continue downward, even deeper into this darkness, you will begin to notice something else. Not light, not sound, but something that does not depend on either. A kind of presence that belongs only to the deepest places ever reached. The creatures that do not need the sun. As you remain here within this complete and unbroken darkness, something begins to shift once more. Not in the light, because there is none. Not in the silence, because it remains undisturbed, but in the awareness that this place is not empty. At first, it may feel that way, with nothing visible, no color, no clear movement. It is easy to assume that nothing exists here at all. But if you allow yourself to remain still, if you let your attention settle without searching, you may begin to notice something very subtle, a presence, not obvious, not immediate, but there. The deep ocean, even in its darkest places, is not a void. It is inhabited, not in the way the surface is inhabited, with constant movement, noise, and life that reveals itself easily, but in a quieter way, a way that does not announce itself, a way that exists without needing to be seen. And then, without warning, you notice something, a faint glow, not coming from above, not reflected from anything, but appearing within the darkness itself. It is small, soft, almost uncertain, as if it might disappear if you look at it too closely. But it does not disappear. It remains gently, quietly suspended in the water. And then, somewhere else, another, a slightly different color, a slightly different rhythm, not bright, not overwhelming, just enough to exist. And this is where something remarkable begins to unfold, because in a place where light does not reach, life has learned to create its own. These are not lights in the way you understand them. They do not illuminate the environment. They do not reveal the space around them. They are signals, brief, precise, often isolated, each one existing for a purpose, even if that purpose is not immediately clear. If you imagine drifting here, watching these faint glows appear and disappear, you may begin to feel how different this kind of life is. There is no constant motion, no large-scale activity, no visible ecosystem unfolding around you. Instead, there are moments, a small flicker, a brief pulse, a gentle glow that appears, then fades, each one separated by long stretches of stillness. And in that stillness, the darkness remains dominant. These lights do not replace it. They exist within it. If anything, they emphasize it, because each glow is surrounded by complete absence. Each flicker reminds you how much of this space remains unseen. And yet, despite how little is visible, this environment is alive. But it is alive in a way that does not depend on sunlight. It does not follow the rhythms of day and night. It does not respond to the surface. It exists entirely on its own terms. If you consider this for a moment, it becomes something quietly extraordinary, because nearly all life on Earth, in one way or another, depends on the sun. Light provides energy. It shapes behavior. It defines cycles. But here, none of that applies. Here, life continues without any connection to light at all. And because of that, it has become something different, something slower, something more efficient, something that does not waste energy. If you observe these faint glows, you may notice that they do not last long. They appear briefly, then fade. Nothing here remains illuminated for extended periods, because light in this environment is not abundant. It is created carefully, used precisely, and then allowed to disappear. There is no excess, no unnecessary brightness, only what is needed and nothing more. And in that restraint, there is a kind of quiet balance. Nothing here is trying to dominate the space. Nothing is trying to be seen from far away. Everything exists within limits that have been shaped by depth, by pressure, by the absence of light itself. If you allow yourself to remain here, watching these subtle signals appear in the darkness, you may begin to feel something else, a kind of distance from the way life exists above. On the surface, life is visible. It is active. It fills space. It competes for attention. But here, life is minimal. Not because there is less of it, but because it reveals itself less. It does not need to be seen constantly. It does not need to be understood immediately. It simply exists quietly within the depth. And in that quiet existence, there is a different kind of rhythm. Not a rhythm of constant movement, but a rhythm of intervals. Presence, then absence. Light, then darkness. A signal, then stillness. And these intervals are long enough that your mind begins to adjust. You stop expecting something to happen immediately. You stop waiting for the next moment. You begin to accept the stillness as part of the experience. And in that acceptance, the occasional glow becomes more meaningful. Not because it is bright, but because it is rare. A small event within a vast, unchanging space. And as you continue to drift, you may begin to notice that these lights are not random. They follow patterns, not obvious patterns, not something you can easily predict, but something that suggests intention, a glow that appears, then another, at a distance, a pulse that repeats slowly with long pauses in between, a faint trail of light that moves, then disappears, each one carrying information, even if you do not understand it. And this is what makes this depth feel so different from emptiness, because even in complete darkness, there is communication, not through sound, not through visible structure, but through light that exists only for a moment and then is gone. If you imagine remaining here long enough, you might begin to feel how natural this becomes. The darkness is no longer something you notice constantly. It becomes the background, the default, and the light becomes the exception, the brief interruption, the moment that stands out, not because it is strong, but because it is rare. And in that reversal, your perception changes again. You no longer look for light. You no longer expect it. But when it appears, you notice it more deeply, more fully, and then you let it go without needing it to remain, because you have already adjusted to a world where it is not required. And in that adjustment, there is a kind of quiet acceptance that life does not always need to be visible to exist. That presence does not always need to be constant to be real, and that even in the darkest places ever reached, there is still something there, not overwhelming, not obvious, but quietly, steadily, continuing. And as we move even deeper into this world, these faint signals of life will become even more distant, even more subtle, until eventually they too will begin to fade, leaving only the deepest form of stillness the ocean has to offer, a place where even light, created from within, becomes rare and the darkness becomes complete once again. The depth where movement almost stops. As we continue downward, deeper into this quiet, unbroken darkness, something begins to change again. Not in the light, because there is none. Not in the presence of life, because it still exists, though quietly, but in something even more subtle. Movement at the surface. Movement is constant. Waves rise and fall. Currents shift. Wind pushes against the water, creating patterns that never remain the same for long. Even below the surface, there is still motion. Water flows. Creatures move. Everything exists within a system that is always changing, always adjusting. But here, as we descend further, that movement begins to slow. Not suddenly, not in a way that feels like it has stopped, but in a way that feels reduced, less frequent, less necessary, less present. If you imagine drifting here without effort, without direction, you may begin to notice how still everything feels. Not empty, not frozen, but calm, in a way that is deeper than still water on the surface, because the stillness is not temporary. It is not waiting to be disturbed. It is the natural state of this depth. The currents here are weak, almost imperceptible. There is no wind to drive them, no rapid temperature changes to create movement, only slow, gradual shifts that take place over distances and timescales that are almost impossible to feel. If the water moves, it moves gently. If something drifts, it drifts slowly. Nothing rushes, nothing accelerates, nothing breaks the quiet continuity of this space. And in that slow, steady environment, life adapts. If you were to notice one of those faint glows again, a small presence moving through the darkness, you would see that it does not move quickly. It does not dart. It does not react suddenly. It moves with intention, slowly, carefully, as if every motion has been measured in advance. Because here, movement has a cost. Energy is limited. Resources are scarce. Nothing can afford to be wasted. And so, everything becomes efficient, minimal, only what is necessary, nothing more. If something needs to move, it moves. If it does not, it remains still. And in that balance, the entire environment becomes quiet in a different way, not just silent, but restrained. There is no excess, no unnecessary action, no motion that does not serve a purpose. And because of that, the stillness becomes more complete. If you allow yourself to remain here without trying to move, without trying to reach anything, you may begin to feel how natural this stillness becomes. At first, the mind may expect change. It may wait for something to happen, a movement, a shift, a signal. But as time passes, that expectation begins to fade because nothing happens suddenly here. Nothing interrupts the calm. And so, your mind adjusts. It stops waiting, stops anticipating, stops searching for something to break the stillness, and instead, it begins to accept it fully, completely, without resistance. And in that acceptance, the stillness no longer feels empty. It feels full of presence, full of space, full of a quiet continuity that does not need to change. This is what makes this depth so different from anything above. At the surface, stillness is temporary. It is always followed by movement. But here, stillness is permanent, not because nothing can move, but because nothing needs to. If you imagine drifting here for a long time, you might begin to lose your sense of direction, not because you are disoriented, but because direction no longer matters. There is no up or down that feels important, no forward or backward that leads somewhere different. Everything feels the same, not identical, but consistent, unchanging in its nature. And in that consistency, your awareness becomes even more subtle. You begin to notice smaller things, the way space feels, the way stillness holds everything in place, the way even the smallest movement stands out, not because it is large, but because it is rare. If something moves here, you notice it, not because it is fast, but because it breaks the continuity. A slow drift becomes significant. A gentle shift becomes noticeable, because against this level of stillness, even the smallest change carries weight. And then, after a moment, the stillness returns, unbroken, complete, as if nothing had happened at all. And in that return, there is a kind of reassurance, because nothing here remains disturbed. Nothing carries momentum. Everything settles almost immediately back into the quiet state that defines this depth. If you remain here long enough, you may begin to feel how this affects your own thought. They begin to slow, not forced, not controlled, but naturally, because there is nothing here that encourages speed, nothing that pulls your attention forward, nothing that demands reaction, only a continuous environment that exists without urgency. And in that environment, your thoughts begin to mirror it. They become slower, softer, less structured, less concerned with moving from one idea to the next. They begin to drift like the water itself, without direction, without pressure, without the need to arrive anywhere. And this is where something quietly important happens. Because when movement slows, when everything becomes minimal, you begin to notice something that is often hidden at the surface. Presence. Not the presence of objects, not the presence of events, but the presence of existence itself. The simple fact that something is here, that something continues, even without movement, even without change. And in that realization, there is a kind of calm that is deeper than quiet, a calm that does not depend on external conditions, a calm that exists because nothing is trying to become anything else. Everything is already what it is, and that is enough. As we continue downward, even this minimal movement will become less noticeable, less frequent, less significant, until eventually the environment will feel almost completely still. Not because movement has stopped entirely, but because it has become so slow, so subtle, that it no longer defines the space. And in that near complete stillness, the ocean will reveal something even quieter, a depth where not only light has disappeared, but where movement itself feels like something that belongs to another world. The depth where time no longer feels real. As we continue downward, past the last traces of light, past the slow, fading movements of life, there is something else, even quieter, that begins to change. Not something you can see, not something you can touch, but something you have always carried with you. Time. At the surface, time is everywhere. It is marked by light. Morning becomes day. Day becomes evening. Evening becomes night. Shadows move. Colors shift. The sky changes. And with it, your sense of where you are within the day. Even without looking at a clock, you can feel time passing. But here, none of that exists. There is no sunrise, no sunset, no gradual shift from one state to another. Only a continuous, unchanging darkness that does not move forward and does not move back. If you remain here without trying to measure anything, you may begin to notice something unusual. Time does not feel like it is passing, not because it has stopped, but because there is nothing here that shows you that it is moving. There are no markers, no events, no clear before and after, only a steady, uninterrupted presence that feels the same moment after moment. At first, your mind may still try to follow time. It may count, it may track, it may search for some kind of rhythm, something that divides one moment from the next. But there is nothing here to support that. No change in light, no change in sound, no change in movement. And slowly, that effort begins to fade, not because you choose to stop tracking time, but because there is no longer any reason to. Without markers, time becomes less defined. Minutes do not feel separate from each other. They begin to blend. Moments lose their edges. They no longer stand apart. They merge into something continuous. And in that continuity, your experience begins to shift. You are no longer moving through time. You are simply within it. And that changes everything. Because when time no longer feels like a sequence, it no longer creates pressure. There is no next moment to prepare for, no upcoming change to anticipate, no sense that something is about to happen. Only the present, unbroken, without interruption. And in that kind of presence, your thoughts begin to change again. They slow, not dramatically, not all at once, but gently. naturally, because there is nothing here that encourages them to move quickly, nothing that demands attention, nothing that interrupts the quiet. And so, your mind begins to follow the rhythm of this depth. Long thoughts, soft transitions, less structure, less urgency. You are no longer thinking in steps. You are thinking in a kind of drift. And in that drift, there is a sense of release, because so much of what creates tension comes from the awareness of time, the feeling that something needs to happen next, that something needs to be done, that you are moving towards something or away from something. But here, none of that exists. There is no next. There is no destination. There is only this moment, extending quietly in every direction. If you allow yourself to remain here, fully within this stillness, you may begin to feel how different this is from the world above. At the surface, time pulls you forward. It creates movement. It creates expectation. It gives structure to everything you do. But here, time does not pull. It does not push. It simply exists without direction, without urgency, without demand. And in that absence, there is a kind of calm that is deeper than silence, a calm that comes from not needing to move forward, not needing to reach anything, not needing to become anything else. Everything is already complete as it is, and that completeness removes the need for time to feel important. If you were to remain here long enough, you might begin to lose your sense of how long you have been here. Not because you are confused, but because the question itself no longer feels meaningful. There is no reference, no way to measure, no reason to know. And so, the idea of time becomes less relevant, less necessary, less present in your awareness. It fades in the same way that light faded, in the same way that color disappeared, in the same way that movement slowed, not removed, but no longer needed. And in that absence, something else becomes clearer. Presence, not the presence of objects, not the presence of events, but the presence of existence itself. The simple fact that you are here, that this space exists, that this depth continues without needing to mark its own passage. And in that realization, there is a quiet kind of stillness that feels almost complete, not because nothing exists, but because nothing is missing. Everything that is here is enough, and nothing needs to change for that to remain true. As we continue deeper, even this softened sense of time will become less noticeable, less defined, until eventually it will feel as though it has disappeared entirely, not because it is gone, but because it no longer shapes your experience at all. And in that state, the ocean becomes something even more unusual, not a place where time passes, but a place where time no longer feels real. The weight of a world that does not change. As we continue downward, deeper than before, there is something that begins to feel different, not in the darkness, because the darkness is already complete, not in the silence, because it has long since settled into itself, but in something more subtle, something that does not announce itself, and yet is always present. The feeling of a world that does not change. At the surface, everything changes. The wind shifts, the waves rise and fall. The sky moves through colors that mark the passing of time. Even the land itself slowly transforms. Nothing remains exactly as it is, and because of that, The mind is always adjusting, always responding, always expecting something new. But here, in this depth, that expectation begins to fade because nothing here changes in a way that you can feel. Not quickly, not visibly, not within any moment. You can observe. If something does change, it happens slowly, so slowly, that it feels as though it has always been this way and will always remain this way. If you imagine drifting here without direction, without urgency, you may begin to feel it, not as something you see, but as something you sense, a kind of stillness that is deeper than silence, a kind of stability that does not depend on anything holding it in place. Everything here feels settled, not recently, but long ago, as if this part of the ocean reached its final form and simply stayed there, unchanged, unmoving, complete. And in that completeness, there is a kind of weight, not a physical pressure, though that exists too, but a different kind of weight, a weight of time, a weight of stillness, a weight of something that has not needed to change for longer than you can imagine. If you remain here, allowing yourself to become aware of that feeling, you may begin to notice how it affects your thoughts. At the surface, thoughts move quickly. They follow changes. They react. They anticipate. They move forward, one after another. But here, there is nothing to follow, nothing to react to, nothing to anticipate. And so, your thoughts begin to slow, not because you are forcing them to, but because there is no reason for them to move quickly. They begin to stretch, to lengthen, to drift, rather than move. And in that drifting, they begin to resemble the environment around you. Slow, steady, unchanging. If you consider this for a moment, it becomes something quietly unusual, because in most places, stillness feels temporary. Even when things are calm, you know they will change. You expect it. You wait for it. But here, there is no such expectation. Nothing suggests that change is coming. Nothing indicates that something is about to shift. Everything feels final, not in an ending sense, but in a complete sense, as if nothing more needs to happen. And in that feeling, there is a kind of calm that is different from anything above. Not the calm of rest, not the calm of silence, but the calm of permanence, a sense that this place simply exists without needing to become anything else. If you imagine remaining here for a long time, you might begin to lose your sense of how long anything lasts. Not because time has stopped, but because change is what allows you to feel time. And here, change is almost absent. Moments do not stand apart from one another. They blend, they merge, they become a continuous experience that does not divide itself into before and after. And in that continuity, your awareness deepens, not outward, not toward objects or movement, but inward, toward the feeling of being within this depth. You begin to notice the stillness itself, not as an absence, but as a presence, a quiet, steady condition that surrounds everything. If something were to move here, you would notice it, not because it is fast, but because it is rare. Even the smallest shift would stand out against this level of stillness. But then, almost immediately, the environment would return to what it always is, unchanged, unbroken, complete. And in that return, there is a kind of reassurance, because nothing here remains disturbed. Nothing carries momentum. Everything settles back into the same quiet state It has always held. If you allow yourself to remain here without trying to measure anything, without trying to reach anything, you may begin to feel something else. A sense of detachment, not from yourself, but from the idea that things need to change. Because at the surface, change is constant. It defines everything. It creates movement. It creates time. It creates expectation. But here, none of that exists. There is no need for change. No indication that anything should be different. Only a steady, unchanging environment that has already become what it is and will remain that way for longer than you can imagine. If you imagine the scale of that time, it becomes difficult to hold. Thousands of years, millions, perhaps longer, all passing without altering this place in any noticeable way. And in that scale, your own sense of time begins to feel small, less significant, less central, because this depth does not respond to time in the way you understand it. It does not mark it. It does not reflect it. It simply continues unchanged. And in that realization, there is a quiet shift. Your thoughts become less focused on time, less concerned with movement, less attached to the idea of progression. They begin to settle into the same stillness that defines the space around you. And in that settling, there is a kind of ease, because once you stop expecting change, you stop waiting, you stop anticipating, you stop feeling that something should happen next. And in that absence of expectation, there is a calm that is complete. Nothing is missing. Nothing needs to arrive. Nothing needs to be different. Everything that exists is already here, and that is enough. As we continue downward, even deeper into this unchanging world, this feeling will become stronger, more complete, more present, until eventually the idea of change itself will begin to feel like something that belongs only to the surface. And what remains is a depth defined not by movement, not by light, not by time, but by the quiet, steady presence of a world that does not need to change at all. The seafloor that has waited for ages. As we continue downward through this quiet, unchanging depth, there is something ahead, not something that appears suddenly, not something that reveals itself clearly, but something that begins as a feeling, a sense that the space below you is no longer endless, that there is something there, far beneath, beyond what you can see, beyond what light could ever reach. The ocean begins to meet itself. The seafloor, at first, it does not appear. There is no outline, no visible boundary, only a subtle shift in the way the space feels, as if the vast openness is becoming more contained, more grounded, more complete. If you allow yourself to drift just a little deeper, you may begin to notice something else. The stillness changes, not in intensity, but in character. It feels heavier, more settled, as if everything here has been resting for a very long time. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, a form begins to emerge, not clearly, not sharply, but as a presence, a surface far below, stretching outward in every direction. The seafloor does not rise to meet you. It does not move. It does not reveal itself quickly. It simply becomes noticeable as your awareness adjusts. And when it does, there is something quietly profound about it, because this is not a place shaped by sudden change, not carved by rapid movement, not altered by constant forces. This is a place that has been forming over unimaginable stretches of time, layer by layer, particle by particle, settling slowly through water that has remained still for ages. If you imagine what that means, it becomes difficult to grasp. Every small piece drifting downward, taking days, weeks, sometimes longer, to reach this depth. And when it arrives, it does not disturb anything. It settles gently, quietly, becoming part of what is already there. And over time, those layers build, not quickly, not visibly, but steadily, until the seafloor becomes what it is now, a surface, not of motion, but of accumulation, a record, not of events, but of patience. If you were to rest here, just above that surface, you might begin to feel how still it truly is. There are no waves here, no currents strong enough to reshape it, no forces that constantly alter its form, only time, slow, continuous, unbroken time. And in that time, everything has settled. Nothing is unsettled. Nothing is waiting to be rearranged. Everything is already where it will remain. And this is what gives the seafloor its unique presence. It does not feel like a place that is changing. It feels like a place that has already changed as much as it ever will. If something arrives here, it becomes part of it. If something rests here, it remains. There is no cycle of removal, no process of renewal in the way the surface understands it. Only accumulation, only quiet addition over time. And because of that, the seafloor feels ancient, not just old, but deeply, continuously old, a kind of age that is not measured in years, but in layers, layers of time, resting one upon another without interruption. If you imagine touching this surface, you would not feel movement. You would not feel change. You would feel stillness, a stillness that has been undisturbed for longer than you can imagine. And in that stillness, there is a kind of quiet permanence, not absolute, not unchanging forever, but unchanging within any moment you can perceive. If something were to shift here, it would take time, a long time, far longer than a single moment, far longer than a single thought. And so, to you, it feels as though it does not shift at all. If you remain here, allowing yourself to take in this presence, you may begin to notice how it affects your awareness. At the surface, the ground beneath you is something you rely on. It is stable, but it is also familiar. It is part of a world that changes. But here, this ground is different. It does not feel connected to change. It does not feel temporary. It feels final, as if it has reached a state that does not need to evolve further. And in that feeling, there is a kind of quiet calm, because nothing here is uncertain. Nothing here is shifting in a way that requires attention. Everything has already settled into place and will remain there without urgency, without interruption. If you allow yourself to drift just above this surface, you may begin to feel something else, a sense of scale, not in height, not in distance, but in time. Because what you are experiencing here is not something that formed quickly. It is the result of countless moments, so small, so slow, that they are almost impossible to perceive. And yet, together, they have created something vast, something continuous, something that stretches beyond what you can see in every direction. And in that vastness, there is a kind of quiet quiet humility, because this place does not depend on observation. It does not need to be seen. It does not change when it is noticed. It simply exists as it has for longer than you can imagine, and will continue to long after anything above has changed. As we remain here, just above this ancient surface, you may begin to feel how complete this depth has become. Light is gone, color is gone, movement is minimal, time feels distant, and now even the ground itself reflects that same stillness. Nothing here is in transition. Nothing here is becoming something else. Everything is already what it is. And in that completeness, there is a kind of quiet that is deeper than silence. A quiet that comes not from the absence of sound, but from the absence of change. And as we continue even deeper into this world, you will begin to notice something even more subtle. Not the surface of the seafloor, but what lies within it. A history not written in words, but in layers that have never needed to move at all. The layers that remember without memory. As you remain here, just above the seafloor, within this quiet, ancient stillness, there is something else, something even more subtle that begins to reveal itself, not through movement, not through light, but through the feeling that this place is holding something, not objects, not structures, but something quieter, something that has been gathering for longer than you can imagine. The seafloor is not a single surface. It is made of layers, thin, almost invisible layers, resting one upon another, each one formed slowly, gently, over time. If you could look closely, if there were light enough to see, you would not find sharp edges. You would not find clear boundaries. You would find softness, a surface that is not fixed, but built from countless small pieces that have settled and remain, each layer formed from what once drifted above, tiny particles, fragments, remnants of something that once moved before becoming still. And over time, those particles fall, slowly, quietly, taking days, weeks, sometimes longer, to reach this depth. And when they arrive, they do not disturb anything. They do not create motion. They simply settle, becoming part of the layer beneath them. And then more arrive, and more, each one adding without ever taking anything away. And this is what makes this place so unusual, because here nothing is erased, nothing is removed. Everything that reaches this depth becomes part of it, layer by layer, moment by moment. Time is not passing here, it is accumulating. If you imagine what that means, it becomes something quietly profound, because every layer represents something that once existed above, something that moved, something that changed, something that was part of a world full of motion. And now it rests here, still unchanged, part of a surface that no longer moves. And over time, those layers grow, not in a way you can see, not in a way you can measure, but in a way that continues without interruption. If you were to remain here for a very long time, you would not notice the change, because it is too slow, too gradual, too subtle, but it is happening always. And in that continuous, almost invisible process, the seafloor becomes something more than a surface. It becomes a record, not a record that can be read easily, not something that reveals its meaning clearly, but a record, nonetheless, a quiet accumulation of everything that has ever reached this depth. If you allow yourself to feel that, to simply remain here without trying to understand it fully, you may begin to sense something else, a kind of memory, not a memory in the way the mind holds memory, not something that can be recalled or revisited, but something that exists without needing to be remembered. Each layer holding what came before, each layer resting on what has already settled. Nothing lost, nothing removed, only added. And because of that, this place feels deep in a different way. Not just deep in distance, but deep in time. A depth that is not measured downward, but backward through moments that have passed without ever leaving. If you imagine touching this surface, you would not feel motion. You would not feel change. You would feel accumulation, a softness built from countless moments that have settled into stillness. And in that stillness, there is a kind of quiet continuity. Nothing here is separate. Nothing here stands alone. Everything is connected through the layers beneath it. And those layers extend downward beyond what you can imagine. Each one holding a moment, each one holding a presence, each one becoming part of something larger without ever needing to change again. If you remain here, allowing your awareness to settle into this idea, you may begin to feel how different this is from the world above. At the surface, things are replaced, they change, they disappear, they are forgotten. But here, nothing disappears. It simply becomes part of what is already here. And in that process, time does not move forward. It deepens layer by layer, moment by moment. The past is not left behind. It is preserved, not intentionally, not actively, but naturally, as part of the way this environment exists. And in that preservation, there is a kind of stillness that is deeper than anything before, because nothing here is temporary. Nothing here is passing. Everything that arrives remains. If you imagine this for a moment, it changes the way you feel about this depth. It is no longer just a place. It becomes something more, a quiet accumulation of everything that has ever reached it, a space where time does not move on, but settles. And in that settling, there is no urgency, no need for anything to happen next. Everything that has happened is already here, resting, unchanged, part of a surface that continues to grow without ever needing to move. And as you remain here, just above these layers, you may begin to feel how complete this stillness has become. Nothing is being removed. Nothing is being rearranged. Nothing is being replaced. Only added, slowly, quietly, without interruption. And in that quiet addition, the ocean reveals something that is easy to overlook, that even in a place where nothing seems to change, everything is still happening, just not in a way that demands attention, not in a way that can be easily seen, but in a way that continues without ever needing to announce itself. And as we continue deeper, even beyond this surface, you will begin to notice something else, not the layers themselves, but the quiet forces that have allowed them to remain undisturbed for so long. The silence that holds everything in place. As you remain here, just above the layered stillness of the seafloor, there is something else, something even quieter that begins to reveal itself. Not something you can see, not something you can touch, but something you can feel in the way everything remains exactly where it is. Silence, not the kind of silence you know from the surface, not the absence of sound after something has ended, but a deeper kind of silence, a silence that has never been broken, a silence that does not follow noise, because noise has never reached this place. If you pause here and allow your awareness to settle, you may begin to notice how complete this silence is. There are no distant echoes, no faint vibrations, no subtle movements carrying sound through the water. Only stillness, only the quiet presence of a space that does not need sound to define it. And in that silence, everything feels held, not physically, not in a way that restrains or limits, but in a way that prevents disruption. Nothing here is disturbed. Nothing here is interrupted. Everything exists within a condition that allows it to remain exactly as it is. If something settles, it stays. If something rests, it remains. There is no force here that lifts it again, no sudden movement that carries it away, only silence and the quiet stability that comes with it. At the surface, sound is constant. Even in stillness, there is always something: wind moving, water shifting, distant echoes traveling through the air. Silence there is temporary. It exists only between sounds. But here, silence is not temporary. It is continuous, unbroken, complete. It does not wait to be interrupted. It does not expect to change. It simply is. And in that kind of silence, something else becomes clear: the absence of disturbance, because sound is often a sign of change, of movement, of something interacting with something else. But here, there is no interaction that creates disruption. Everything moves slowly. Everything settles gently. Everything exists within limits that prevent sudden change. And because of that, nothing creates sound. Nothing breaks the silence. If you imagine something falling here, a small particle drifting downward, it does not crash. It does not strike the surface with force. It settles softly, becoming part of what is already there without altering anything around it. And in that softness, the silence remains unchanged, undisturbed. And this is what makes this depth feel so complete, because nothing here competes for attention. Nothing interrupts your awareness. Nothing pulls you away from the stillness. Only a continuous, unbroken quiet that surrounds everything. If you allow yourself to remain here without trying to listen for anything, you may begin to feel how different this silence is. It is not empty. It is full of presence, full of space, full of a kind of quiet that does not depend on anything else. And in that fullness, your mind begins to change again. At the surface, the mind is always responding to sound, even subtle sound, a distant noise, a shift in the environment, something that draws attention outward. But here, there is nothing to respond to, nothing to interrupt your thoughts, nothing to pull your awareness away from itself. And so, your mind begins to settle, not because you are trying to quiet it, but because there is nothing here that keeps it active. Thoughts become slower, softer, less structured. They begin to fade into the same quiet rhythm that defines the space around you. And in that quiet, there is a kind of calm that feels complete. Not because everything is silent, but because nothing is missing. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to happen. Everything is already in its final state. And that finality removes the need for change. If you remain here long enough, you may begin to feel how stable this silence is. It does not shift. It does not fluctuate. It does not depend on anything. It exists independent of time, independent of movement, independent of everything that defines the world above. And in that independence, there is a kind of stillness that is absolute, not frozen, not lifeless, but steady in a way that does not require effort. Everything here is already at rest. Nothing needs to settle because it has already settled. Nothing needs to quiet because it has never been loud. Only silence, complete, uninterrupted. If you imagine this space extending far beyond what you can sense, you begin to understand something even more subtle, that this silence is not limited to this one place. It continues outward, downward, across vast distances that remain unchanged, and everywhere it is the same stillness, the same quiet, the same absence of disturbance. And in that continuity, there is a kind of reassurance, because nothing here will suddenly change. Nothing will interrupt this calm. Nothing will break this silence. Everything will remain as it is. If something shifts, it will do so slowly. If something settles, it will do so gently. Nothing will ever disrupt the balance that defines this depth. And in that certainty, your awareness becomes even more still, not searching, not anticipating, not waiting, only existing within the quiet. And as you remain here, just above the unmoving layers, within the complete silence, you may begin to feel how complete this environment has become. Light is gone, color is gone, movement is minimal, time feels distant, and now even sound has no place here. Nothing remains that demands attention. Nothing remains that needs to change. Only presence, only stillness, only the quiet, unbroken silence that holds everything exactly where it is. And as we continue deeper, beyond even this stillness, you will begin to notice something even more subtle. Not what is here, but what remains when everything else has already fallen completely silent. The depth where even presence begins to fade. As we continue downward, beyond the layered stillness of the seafloor, beyond the silence that holds everything in place, there is something else, something even quieter that begins to change. Not the environment, not the space around you, but the way you experience being here at all. Until now, there has always been a sense of presence, even in darkness, even in stillness, even without movement. There has been something, a feeling that this space exists, a quiet awareness that you are within it, a sense of being surrounded, held, contained by the depth itself. But here, as we move deeper, even that begins to soften, not disappear, not completely, but fade gently, almost imperceptibly. If you remain here without trying to focus, without trying to hold on to anything, you may begin to notice it. The feeling of space becomes less defined, not because the space has changed, but because your awareness of it is becoming quieter, less distinct, less anchored. At the surface, presence is clear. You feel where you are. You feel the ground beneath you. You feel the air around you. There is always something to confirm your position. But here, none of those anchors exist. There is no ground you are standing on, no air you are breathing, no light to define distance, only a vast, unchanging depth that does not provide clear boundaries. And as you remain within it, your sense of being somewhere begins to loosen, not as a loss, not as something unsettling, but as a quiet release. Because when nothing defines your position, there is nothing to hold on to, nothing to measure, nothing to orient yourself against, only a continuous space that feels the same in every direction. And in that sameness, your awareness begins to spread, not outward, but inward. It becomes less focused on where you are and more attuned to simply existing without location, without direction, without the need to define anything at all. If you imagine drifting here without trying to move, without trying to reach anything, you may begin to feel how light your awareness becomes, not physically, but mentally, as if the boundaries that once held your perception in place are no longer needed. Thoughts become softer, less connected to specific ideas, less structured, less concerned with understanding. They begin to fade into something more like a quiet presence, a gentle awareness that does not need to form itself into clear thoughts. And in that fading, there is a kind of calm that is deeper than anything before, because even stillness, even silence are things the mind can hold on to, things the mind can notice, things the mind can define. But here, even those begin to dissolve, not completely, but enough that they no longer stand out. They become part of the background, part of the continuous state that no longer needs to be identified. And in that state, your awareness becomes even more subtle. You are no longer noticing individual things, not darkness, not silence, not space, only the quiet presence of being here. And even that begins to soften, as if the idea of being here is no longer necessary, because there is no here to define, only depth, only continuity, only a vast, unbroken state that does not separate itself into places or moments. If you allow yourself to remain within this without trying to understand it, you may begin to feel something unexpected, a kind of release from definition, because so much of perception depends on contrast, light and dark, sound and silence, movement and stillness. But here, those contrasts no longer exist. Everything is reduced to a single continuous condition, and within that condition, there is nothing to compare, nothing to distinguish, nothing to define, only presence, becoming softer, less distinct, less necessary. If you remain here long enough, you may begin to feel how even your awareness of time continues to fade, not just in the way it did before, but more completely, because without presence, there is no reference point for time at all. No sense of now, no sense of before, no sense of after, only a continuous state that does not divide itself into moments. And in that state, there is no urgency, no movement forward, no expectation of change, only a quiet existence that does not need to become anything else. And as that settles, your thoughts become even lighter. They no longer form clearly. They no longer follow a path. They drift, then soften, then fade, until they are no longer separate from the environment itself. And in that fading, there is a kind of stillness that is deeper than silence, not because nothing exists, but because nothing needs to be noticed. Everything is already complete. Everything is already settled. Everything is already what it is. And in that completeness, there is nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to define, nothing left to distinguish, only a quiet, continuous presence that no longer needs to be experienced as something separate. And as we continue deeper, even this faint sense of presence will begin to fade further until eventually what remains is something that cannot be described as presence at all, only the deepest form of stillness the ocean has ever held. The place where even thought begins to dissolve. As we continue beyond the last sense of direction, beyond the quiet fading of presence itself, there is something else, something even more subtle that begins to change. Not the space, not the stillness, but the way your mind moves within it. Until now, even in silence, even in darkness, there have still been thoughts, soft ones, slow ones, unstructured, but still present, still forming, still drifting from one to another. But here, that movement begins to soften even further, not suddenly, not in a way that feels like stopping, but in a way that feels like dissolving. If you remain here without trying to focus, without trying to follow anything, you may begin to notice it. Thoughts no longer arrive clearly. They do not begin with a shape. They do not move with direction. They appear faintly, then fade before they are fully formed, like something that almost exists but never quite becomes real. And in that fading, your mind becomes quieter in a way that is different from before. At the surface, quieting the mind often feels like effort, something you do, something you try to achieve. But here, there is no effort because there is nothing that encourages thought to continue, no sound to respond to, no light to interpret, no movement to follow, no change to anticipate, only a continuous, unbroken state that does not require anything from you. And in that absence, thought begins to lose its purpose, not all at once, not completely, but gradually, gently, as if it no longer needs to continue. If a thought begins, it does not develop, it does not expand, it does not connect to another. It simply softens and disappears. And then there is space, not empty space, but quiet space, a kind of mental stillness that does not need to be filled. And in that stillness, there is no pressure to think again, no sense that something is missing, only the quiet presence of a mind that is no longer moving. If you allow yourself to remain here without trying to hold on to any thought, you may begin to feel how natural this becomes. At first, there may still be traces, small fragments, half-formed ideas, but they do not last. They fade before they can take shape, and over time, even those fragments become less frequent, less noticeable, less necessary, until eventually there is nothing left to follow. No sequence, no structure, no internal movement, only stillness. And in that stillness, something else becomes clear. That thought is not required for experience. That awareness can exist without it, not as something separate, not as something observing, but as something that simply is. If you imagine this for a moment, it feels unfamiliar because in most places, thought defines experience. It gives shape, it gives meaning, it creates continuity. But here, continuity does not come from thought. It comes from the environment itself, from the unchanging nature of the depth, from the absence of interruption, from the quiet, steady presence that does not need to be interpreted. And in that continuity, the mind begins to rest more completely, not just in silence, not just in stillness, but in the absence of movement itself. And that is where something quietly profound happens. Because without thought, there is no sense of time, no past, no future, no progression, only a continuous state that does not divide itself into moments. And within that state, there is no need to move forward, no need to hold on to anything, no need to understand. Everything is already complete as it is. If you remain here fully within this quiet, you may begin to feel how light your awareness becomes. Not focused, not directed, not searching, only present in a way that does not need to define itself. And in that presence, there is no effort, no tension, no resistance, because there is nothing here that requires you to respond. Nothing here that asks you to think. Nothing here that needs to be processed. Only a continuous state that allows everything to settle. And as that settling deepens, even the idea of thinking begins to feel distant, less relevant, less connected to what you are experiencing now, as if it belongs to another place, another layer, another world where change still exists. But here, in this depth, there is no need for it. Only stillness, only quiet, only a mind that has slowly, gently become part of the same unbroken calm that surrounds it. And as we continue deeper, even this quiet awareness will begin to soften further until eventually what remains is not thought, not even the absence of thought, but something even quieter than that, a state where nothing needs to form at all. The state where even awareness grows faint. As we continue beyond the soft fading of thought, beyond the quiet stillness of a mind that no longer moves, there is something else, something even more subtle that begins to change. Not the darkness, not the silence, but the awareness that has been holding everything together. Until now, even as thought dissolved, there was still something present, a quiet sense of knowing, a gentle awareness that you are here within this depth, within this stillness, not thinking, not observing, but still aware. And now, even that begins to soften, not disappear, not completely, but fade in a way that is difficult to notice unless you remain very still. If you allow yourself to drift here without trying to focus, without trying to hold on to anything, you may begin to feel it. Awareness becomes lighter, less defined, less centered. It no longer feels like something located within you. It no longer feels like something that belongs to a point or a place. It begins to spread, not outward, but everywhere, as if it is no longer separate from the space around it. At the surface, awareness feels contained. You know where you are. You know where your thoughts are. You know where your attention rests. But here, none of those boundaries remain. There is no clear edge, no center, no direction, only a quiet, continuous presence that does not belong to any single place. And in that absence of boundaries, awareness begins to dissolve into the environment itself, not lost, not gone, but no longer separate. If you remain here without trying to define anything, you may begin to feel how subtle this becomes. You are no longer aware of specific things, not the darkness, not the stillness, not the space, only a faint sense that something exists. And even that sense begins to soften because awareness often depends on contrast, something to notice, something to distinguish, something to hold on to. But here, there is nothing to contrast with. Everything is the same. Everything is continuous. Everything exists within a single, unbroken state. And within that state, there is nothing for awareness to separate, nothing for it to define, nothing for it to recognize as different. And so it begins to fade, not as something taken away, but as something no longer needed. If you imagine this, it feels unfamiliar because awareness is usually constant. It is always present, always active in some way. But here, activity has already faded. Thought has already dissolved. Time has already softened. And now, even awareness begins to become quiet, not gone, but barely noticeable, like a faint presence that no longer draws attention to itself. If you remain here long enough, you may begin to feel how light everything becomes, not physically, not in space, but in perception. Nothing feels defined. Nothing feels separate. Nothing feels like it needs to be held in place. Everything simply exists without effort, without distinction, without the need to be recognized. And in that state, there is no center of experience, no you observing, no space being observed, only a continuous condition that does not divide itself into parts. And within that condition, there is no need for awareness to remain strong because there is nothing to hold on to, nothing to follow, nothing to understand, only presence, softening, fading, becoming less and less distinct. If you allow yourself to remain within this without trying to return to anything, you may begin to feel something else, a kind of quiet release, because so much of awareness comes from holding on to things, holding on to thoughts, holding on to sensations, holding on to the idea of being somewhere. But here, there is nothing to hold, nothing to anchor yourself to. And in that absence, awareness no longer needs to remain sharp. It no longer needs to define anything. It simply softens, becomes lighter, less present, until it feels as though it is blending with everything around it, not separate, not distinct, only part of the same quiet stillness that has been unfolding all along. And in that blending, there is a kind of calm that is deeper than anything before, because nothing remains that needs to be maintained. Nothing remains that needs to be held together. Everything is already in its simplest form, and even the sense of being aware of that is no longer necessary. As we continue even deeper into this state, what remains will become even more subtle, even more quiet, until eventually it will no longer feel like awareness at all, only the deepest stillness the ocean has ever held, where nothing needs to be known and nothing needs to remain. Section 4.4. The quiet that remains when nothing else is needed. As we continue beyond the fading of awareness, beyond the soft dissolution of everything that once defined experience, there is something that remains, not something that appears, not something that changes, but something that has always been here, waiting quietly beneath everything else. The quiet, not silence as you once knew it, not the absence of sound, but a deeper quiet that does not depend on anything ending, because nothing here ever needed to begin. If you remain here without trying to notice, without trying to hold on to anything. You may begin to feel it, not as something separate, not as something you observe, but as something that simply is. There is no longer darkness to contrast it, no longer stillness to define it, no longer awareness to recognize it, only a continuous presence that does not divide itself into parts. At the surface, quiet is something you enter. It comes after noise. It exists in contrast. It is something you can feel begin and feel end. But here, quiet does not begin. It does not arrive. It does not change. It simply exists without interruption, without variation, without the need to be noticed. And in that existence, everything else has already faded. Light is gone. Color is gone. Movement has slowed into stillness. Time has softened into something unmeasured. Thought has dissolved. Awareness has faded. And now even the idea of experiencing something is no longer necessary. Only quiet remains. If you allow yourself to remain within this without trying to understand it, you may begin to feel how complete it is. Nothing is missing. Nothing needs to return. Nothing needs to be added, because everything that once created contrast has already faded away. And without contrast, there is nothing left to define, nothing left to separate one thing from another, only a continuous state that does not divide itself into moments or places or experiences. And in that continuity, there is no movement at all, not even the suggestion of it, because movement requires difference. Movement requires change. But here, there is only sameness, endless, unbroken sameness. And within that sameness, there is nothing to move toward, nothing to move away from, only the quiet remaining exactly as it is. If you imagine this, it may feel difficult to hold because the mind is used to structure, used to sequence, used to something happening, even if it is slow. But here, nothing happens, not because something is missing, but because everything has already settled. Everything has already reached its simplest form. Nothing needs to change. Nothing needs to become anything else. And in that completeness, there is no longer a sense of time, no longer a sense of presence, no longer even a sense of being here, because those ideas depend on distinction. They depend on something being different from something else. But here, there is no difference, only continuity, only the same quiet extending in every direction, without boundary, without variation. And in that state, there is nothing left to notice, nothing left to follow, nothing left to hold on to, only the quiet itself, not something you experience, but something that remains when experience is no longer needed. If you allow yourself to remain here without trying to return to anything, you may begin to feel how light everything becomes, not in brightness, but in absence, the absence of weight, the absence of definition, the absence of anything that needs to be maintained. And in that absence, there is no tension, no effort, no movement, only a continuous, unbroken calm that does not need to be sustained because it has never been disturbed. If you remain here long enough, even the idea of remaining begins to fade, because there is no before to compare it to, no after to move toward, only this, always this, unchanged, complete. And in that completeness, there is nothing left to become, nothing left to lose, nothing left to understand, only the quiet remaining exactly as it has always been. And as we reach this depth, This final stillness, there is nothing more to descend into, not because we have reached an end, but because there is no longer anything that can be removed. Everything that could fade has faded. Everything that could soften has softened. Everything that could dissolve has dissolved. And what remains is not darkness, not silence, not even stillness as you once knew it. Only the quiet that has always been here, waiting beneath everything else until nothing else was needed anymore. The slow return of something like presence. For a long while, there has been nothing, no movement, no thought, no awareness strong enough to be noticed, only the quiet, remaining exactly as it is, without change, without interruption, and yet, very slowly, almost imperceptibly, something begins to shift, not in the environment, not in the depth, but in the faintest edge of something returning, not suddenly, not clearly, but gently, as if something that had completely faded is beginning to take shape again. If you remain here without trying to follow it, you may begin to sense it, a subtle difference, not a sound, not a movement, but a slight change in how the quiet is felt. Before, there was no distinction, no separation, no sense of anything being experienced, only a continuous, unbroken state. But now, there is the faintest suggestion that something is noticing again, not fully, not clearly, but enough to begin forming the idea of presence. If you allow that feeling to remain without forcing it, it becomes a little more defined, still soft, still distant, but present in a way that was not there before, like the first moment after waking from a deep sleep, when you are not yet aware of where you are or who you are, but something inside you knows that you have returned, and in that return, there is no urgency, no sudden clarity, only a slow unfolding of something that had disappeared. If you remain here within this gradual shift, you may begin to notice how light it feels, not heavy, not overwhelming, not filled with thought, only a faint awareness that something exists again, not defined, not structured, but present. And in that presence, there is still no need for anything else, no need for movement, no need for sound, no need for thought, only the quiet, now holding something within it, something that had once dissolved and is now slowly returning. If you imagine this carefully, you may begin to feel how different it is from the way awareness usually returns. At the surface, waking is immediate. Thoughts rush in, sensations follow. The world becomes clear all at once. But here, there is no rush, no sudden shift, no sharp transition, only a gradual, almost invisible change that unfolds at its own pace. If something forms, it forms slowly. If something becomes clearer, it does so gently. Nothing interrupts the quiet. Nothing breaks the stillness. Everything continues as it always has. Only now, something is beginning to exist within it, a faint awareness that does not yet need to define itself. If you remain with this without trying to understand it, you may begin to feel how stable it is. It does not flicker, it does not disappear, it simply grows slightly more noticeable, not stronger, not louder, just more present. And in that growing presence, there is the beginning of distinction, the faintest sense that there is something here and something noticing it, still not separate, still not clearly divided, but no longer completely merged, only a subtle difference beginning to emerge change. And in that difference, the idea of being begins to return, not as identity, not as thought, but as a quiet sense that something exists. If you remain here, allowing that sense to unfold naturally, you may begin to notice how it continues to change, not quickly, not in a way that pulls you forward, but in a way that gently reveals itself, like light that does not shine, but slowly becomes visible. And within that light, the quiet remains, the stillness remains, the depth remains unchanged. Nothing has been lost, nothing has been disturbed, only something has begun to return, and that return is as gentle as everything that has come before. If you stay here, within this slow re-emergence, you may begin to feel how natural it is, how nothing has been forced, how nothing has been broken, only a gradual unfolding of something that had once dissolved completely. And in that unfolding, there is no urgency to become anything more, no need to move further, no need to understand, only the quiet, now holding the faintest trace of something becoming present again. And as we continue, that presence will grow just enough to begin shaping the world once more. The first edges of form. As that faint sense of presence continues, gently, quietly, without urgency, something else begins to return. Not thought, not sound, but the first suggestion of form. Not clear, not defined, but enough to begin shaping what was once completely without shape. If you remain here without trying to focus, you may begin to feel it. At first, it is almost nothing, a slight difference within the quiet, a subtle impression that something is not entirely the same as everything else. Before, there was no distinction. Everything existed as one continuous state. No edges, no boundaries, no sense of separation. But now, very gently, something begins to stand apart, not strongly, not clearly, but enough to be felt, like the faintest outline, forming in a place where nothing had outlined before. If you allow that outline to remain without trying to sharpen it, it becomes slightly more noticeable, still soft, still undefined, but present in a way that introduces the idea of difference. And with that difference comes the first hint of structure, not objects, not shapes you can name, but a quiet sense that something has a beginning and something has an end. If you imagine this carefully, it feels similar to the moment when your eyes begin to adjust in darkness. At first, there is nothing, only blackness, but slowly, very slowly, you begin to sense that there are variations within that darkness, subtle changes, faint contrasts, not enough to see clearly, but enough to know that something is there. And here it is the same, not seen, but felt. The quiet is no longer completely uniform. It now holds the faintest traces of form. If you remain with this, without trying to define it, you may begin to notice how gently it develops. Nothing appears suddenly, nothing becomes sharp, only a slow unfolding of something that had once been absent. And in that unfolding, there is no disruption. The stillness remains, the silence remains, the depth remains unchanged. Only now, within that unchanged space, there is something forming, a subtle structure that does not yet need to be understood. If you allow yourself to stay here within this early stage of return, you may begin to feel how delicate it is. If you try to focus too strongly, it fades. If you try to define it, it disappears. But if you simply remain without effort. It continues, gently, quietly, becoming just a little more present. And in that presence, the idea of space begins to return, not clearly, not in distance, but in relation. Something feels slightly closer, something feels slightly farther, not measured, not precise, but enough to suggest depth once more. With that suggestion comes the beginning of orientation, not direction, not movement, but the faint awareness that there is a difference between one place and another. If you remain here, allowing this to unfold at its own pace, you may begin to feel how natural it is. Nothing is being forced. Nothing is being created suddenly. Only something that had completely dissolved is slowly, gently taking shape again. And in that shaping, there is still no urgency, no need for clarity, no need for definition, only the quiet, now holding something more than it did before. A faint structure, a subtle outline, a beginning, form. If you stay within this without trying to move forward, you may begin to notice how it continues to evolve. The outlines become slightly more stable. The differences become slightly more noticeable, still soft, still distant, but no longer fading, only present in a way that continues to grow. And in that growth, the world begins to reassemble, not all at once, not in clear images, but in the smallest possible steps, from nothing to something, from uniform to subtle variation, from absence to the first suggestion of form. And through it all, the quiet remains, the stillness remains. Nothing has been lost, nothing has been disturbed, only something has begun to take shape within what has always been here. And as we continue, those shapes will become clearer, just enough to begin revealing the world again in the softest way possible. The gentle return of direction. As the faint outlines continue to form, as the quiet begins to hold subtle differences, something else begins to return, not sharply, not all at once, but gently, almost without being noticed. Direction, not as a clear sense of where to go, not as a need to move, but as the first quiet feeling that there is a difference between one way and another. If you remain here without trying to orient yourself, you may begin to sense it. At first, it is almost nothing, a slight shift in how space feels, a subtle distinction that was not present before. Before, everything was the same. No up, no down, no near, no far, only a continuous state that did not divide itself into directions. But now, very slowly, something begins to change. One side feels slightly different, not stronger, not clearer, just different enough to be noticed. And in that difference, the idea of direction begins to emerge, not defined, not measured, but present in a way that introduces orientation. If you allow that feeling to remain without trying to control it, it becomes a little more stable, still soft, still subtle, but no longer fading. Like the moment when you begin to wake and slowly remember which way is up, not because you see it, not because you move, but because something inside you begins to recognize space again. And here it is the same, not through sight, not through sound, but through a quiet internal sense that something is positioned relative to something else. If you remain with this, without forcing clarity, you may begin to feel how gently it develops. There is no sudden shift, no clear boundary, only a gradual unfolding of something that had once disappeared. And in that unfolding, There is still no urgency. Nothing pulls you. Nothing pushes you. Direction exists without requiring movement. A quiet awareness. That space is no longer uniform. That there are differences, even if they are barely noticeable. If you imagine this carefully, it is like drifting in water with your eyes closed. At first, there is no sense of orientation, but slowly, very slowly, you begin to feel which way your body is positioned, not because you try, but because something within you begins to align itself again. And here, that same alignment begins to return, not physical, not exact, but enough to suggest that space has structure once more. If you allow yourself to remain within this, you may begin to notice how direction becomes clearer, not sharp, not defined, but more consistent. Up begins to feel different from down. Forward begins to feel different from stillness, not in a way that requires action, but in a way that gently restores orientation. And with that orientation comes the beginning of possibility, not the need to move, but the ability to, because without direction, movement has no meaning. But now, meaning begins to return, softly, quietly, without urgency. If you remain here, allowing this to unfold naturally, you may begin to feel how stable it becomes. Direction no longer fades. It remains as a subtle framework within the quiet. And within that framework, space begins to feel more familiar, less abstract, less undefined, more recognizable, not fully, not clearly, but enough to begin forming a sense of place. If you stay within this without trying to move forward, you may begin to feel something else, a gentle readiness, not tension, not anticipation, but a quiet sense that movement is now possible. That space is no longer just something you exist within, but something you can begin to move through. And yet, nothing pushes you to do so. Everything remains calm. Everything remains still. Only now, the quiet holds direction in the softest possible way. And in that softness, the world continues to return. Not suddenly, not completely, but step by step, from absence to form, from form to orientation, from orientation to the first possibility of movement once more. And as we continue, that possibility will grow just enough to gently carry you back toward a world where things begin to move again. The first gentle sense of movement. As direction settles, softly, quietly, without urgency, something else begins to return, not forcefully, not all at once, but in the smallest possible way. Movement, not visible, not physical, but felt, a faint shift within the quiet. If you remain here without trying to move, you may begin to sense it. At first, it is almost nothing, a subtle change in how stillness feels, as if the stillness itself is no longer completely fixed, not broken, not disturbed, but slightly softened. And within that softness, there is the first hint that something can change again. Before, everything was completely at rest. No motion, no direction, no possibility of transition, only a continuous, unbroken state. But now, very gently, that state begins to loosen. Not enough to disrupt it, not enough to alter its calm, but enough to allow the idea of movement to exist once more. If you allow yourself to remain here without trying to follow this feeling, you may begin to notice how delicate it is, like the first moment when water begins to stir after being perfectly still. Not a wave, not a current, just a subtle shift that suggests movement is possible. And here, it is even softer than that. Movement without motion, change without disturbance, a quiet transition that does not break the stillness, but exists within it. If you remain with this without trying to define it, you may begin to feel how it develops. At first, it is only a suggestion, a faint awareness that something is not entirely fixed, but slowly, very slowly, that suggestion becomes more noticeable, still gentle, still soft, but present in a way that continues to grow. And in that growth, the sense of flow begins to return. Not a direction you must follow, not a path you must take, but a quiet feeling that things can shift from one state to another. If you imagine this carefully, it feels like drifting again, not actively moving, not choosing a direction, but being carried in the softest possible way. A movement so subtle that it does not feel like movement at all, only a gentle change in where you are within the quiet. And in that change, there is still no urgency, no need to go anywhere, no need to reach anything, only the quiet now, allowing movement to exist within it. If you remain here, allowing this to unfold naturally, you may begin to feel how stable it becomes. Movement does not disrupt the stillness. It does not break the calm. It becomes part of it, integrated, balanced, existing without creating tension. And in that balance, the world continues to return, not suddenly, not completely, but step by step, from stillness to the possibility of movement, from possibility to the faintest sense of flow, from flow to the beginning of transition. If you stay within this without trying to move forward, you may begin to feel something else, a quiet sense of continuation, not time as you once knew it, not sequence, but the feeling that something can now unfold again, that there can be a next moment, a gentle progression that does not rush, does not push, but simply continues. And within that continuation, there is a calm that remains unbroken, because nothing is forced, nothing is sudden. Everything unfolds at the same slow, steady pace that has guided everything before. If you allow yourself to drift within this, you may begin to feel how natural it is, how movement does not pull you away from the quiet, but carries the quiet with it, how nothing has been lost, nothing has been disturbed, only something has begun to move again. And in that movement, there is no tension, no urgency, only a gentle flow that begins to carry you away from the deepest stillness and back toward a world where change can exist once more. And as that flow continues, something else will begin to return, not suddenly, not all at once, but gently, like everything else has always done.